I did not have the good fortune to know Dr. Antony, but I have heard much about him as a very distinguished academic scholar, as well as a great colleague, social activist. In fact, Prakash Mash was just speaking about him with me a few minutes ago. So I am really honored that I was invited to do this annual lecture in his honor here. So when Prakash Mash invited me, he mentioned that the audience would largely comprise students and teachers of literature. Yeah? So I thought it would be appropriate to have a discussion on literature as we engage with it in the classroom, both as students and as teachers. Now we know that literature has become a kind of difficult category to define, especially over the past decades. And this is particularly the case with English literature, because sometimes, like in this period of 40 odd years when I have taught in different places, the identity of what we do in the English department has become less and less clear. And in fact, in the last 10 or 15 years of my teaching career, sometimes it occurred to me that probably we teach most things apart from English literature in the English literature departments. Because we do, like in JNU for instance, or Delhi University, a lot of the research which comes out of the English departments is not about English literature. It's not about literature written in the UK or in the US, or even literature written in English in India. Sometimes it is about literature written in Indian languages, sometimes literature written in other languages and in translation. Sometimes it does not really have to do with literature, but cultural phenomena, cultural practices, and cinema, other kinds of media. Sometimes it has even generated research which involves what would traditionally be seen as work in cultural anthropology, like documenting the practices of some particular community or particular subcultures within our neighborhood. So what exactly what do we do in the literature departments? What is the kind of training we get? This is an interesting question. And I thought one of the things which we do, in spite of all these transformations, or through all these transformations, is a certain training in reading, what you can broadly call reading. So what exactly is literary reading in the way it has changed over time? What kind of possibilities does it offer in the present time? This is the kind of thing that I would like to speak about today. Now, one thing is very important to remember. Literary reading is actually different from a strict academic reading of literature, because we know that most of the literature was not written to be taught in academic institutions. When people wrote novels or poems, the last thing most of them thought about is they're getting prescribed in syllabi in universities. The author I worked on for my PhD, James Joyce, was an exception. Joyce, when he completed Ulysses, you know that it has a lot of allusions. There are directories of allusions in Ulysses, hidden references. And some directories actually go up to more than 10,000 allusions, etc. And of course, Joyce's last work, Finnegan's Wake, still we do not know how many allusions are there. So somebody asked Joyce about this, and he said that I have put so many puzzles into that book that it will keep professors in universities arguing for 100 years. That is the only way to ensure one's immortality. Yeah? So, but Joyce was an exception. Most of the interesting literature is not written for universities. So the reading which we do when we engage with literature outside the university, like many of us have come to literature departments to study literature because we are interested in reading novels, poems, and all kinds of things. Not necessarily in English, like I, for example, came to English literature because I was interested in Malayalam literature as a student. But that reading is quite different from the kind of analytical reading which we are trained to do in the academic context. Now, so what we do in the English departments or literature departments is, on the one hand, a study of this phenomenon of literature, and on the other hand, a study of the practices of literary reading which exist in society, the way in which people actually read literature, assign value to literature, and this is something which undergoes changes in different periods in time. When I joined English department as a teacher, like that was actually in the late 80s, it was in Pune University, that was a very important moment in the kind of history of English studies in India. This was the time when English syllabi were being revised. There was a lot of talk about the crisis in English studies at that time. There were conferences organized around that time. And when we look back, the key initiators of that rethinking were women scholars, many of them feminist scholars, who criticized, on the one hand, the dominance of British literature in the syllabi, and on the other hand, the underrepresentation of women writers in the syllabi. So both these changed dramatically. Like over the past 40 years, these things have changed considerably. So as a result of that, the shape of English literary studies changed over a period of time. So now nobody would think that what we study English literature in order to get some kind of civilizing moral instruction, which was actually a kind of colonial agenda. Not only colonial, even in post-colonial India, it was very strong when I began doing my BA, etc. Matthew Arnold was a very important presence in organizing the syllabi at that time. Now all that has changed. So what is literary studies now? Like I told you, it is no longer really about English literature or even necessarily things that are called literary. Literature departments after the 90s have become what I may call a space for interdisciplinary humanities. And that reinvention of literature departments as spaces of interdisciplinary humanities is what has given English departments a really vibrant new life in Indian universities. So this, of course, raises the question, what is actually the task of humanities now? Now the word humanities is very widely used now. You will find it in private universities in their structures. Many of them have what's called liberal studies programs, which have a humanities component. Before you specialize, you are expected to have an introduction to humanities disciplines, regardless of whether you become a scientist or a political scientist or literature scholar. And the government's own initiatives, like the National Education Policy, for example, it also speaks about critical thinking, about humanities, etc., etc. So humanities is actually used in very, very different senses. Sometimes it is used as a kind of grooming for a professional life in a new kind of economy, new kind of professional world, which some people would call a neoliberal world. Sometimes it is used in support of a kind of governmental or statist nationalist project where humanities is actually seen as the ability to find solutions to problems. Yeah. So the idea of humanities, which I am going to actually explore here, may be distinguished from these tendencies a bit by the term critical humanities. Humanities itself as a space of criticism, as a space of interrogation. In fact, critical humanities works in a way in the reverse direction to what the governmental project is, not by finding solutions to existing problems, but by challenging accepted solutions and things which we see as settled, converting them into problems, problematizing them. So it is this kind of reading what kind of reading is involved in that. Is it clear to you what I'm saying? Is it okay? Yeah. If I'm going too fast or something, you can stop me. Yeah? So this is really what I'm actually trying to speak about. Now, the word critical also creates a lot of problems. Now if you look at university syllabi and brochures in the US or UK, and increasingly in India, you will find the word critical thinking. Even the NEP document has the word critical thinking, critical reading, etc., etc. But what exactly is critical thinking and critical reading? It's very difficult to define. People don't often define it. Similarly, the word critical reading again is actually not defined easily. Often, the idea of critical reading in the humanities, especially in the context of literature, is seen as coming from philosophical positions and theories, mainly which developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which took a skeptical attitude to what is presented before you by phenomena. Like when you are reading a literary text, the literary text apparently tells you something, but it may actually have a secret meaning or a hidden meaning. Its positions and its preferences, which it actually gets you to believe in, may actually be different from what it apparently seems to say. Like people have written about Jane Austen, for example. Jane Austen seems to be talking about the key question is who should the heroine marry? And isn't it? Like there are usually two people. One of them is a boring man, and the other person is very dashing and attractive. But in the course of the novel, that attractive man turns out to be of somewhat dubious kind of moral qualities, and the initially dull-looking person becomes the solid person whom the heroine marries. And the dull-looking person who is solid, he also turns out to be landed gentry, coming from a kind of tradition of wealth, rather than somebody who has made money more recently, either by becoming a soldier or joining the military or joining the mercantile class. Yeah? So apparently this is about love. But some literary critics who take a critical position would say that beneath this romantic text of love, there is a kind of latent text which is about economic interests, the competition and contestation between different social classes in England of that time, etc., etc. I'm just giving you a simple example. So this tendency of reading the text against the grain, finding what the text does not directly tell you, this became a key gesture of the critical reading habit. And in my teaching career, which also coincides with a little bit with Prakash Mash's or Madhavan's, we saw the ascendancy of this method. Ascendancy of this method to such an extent that even before we begin reading a text, we have this skeptical attitude of finding out what is the hidden agenda behind this. Yeah? So, like I had difficulty, in my last years of teaching in DU, I was teaching Plato's Republic, the famous book 9, book 10, where Plato supposedly banishes the poets from the Republic. I couldn't get them to read the book and think about the words which are being used, what exactly is the argument. I couldn't get them to remember that Plato himself was a poet, because they all had decided that Plato was a fascist. Although fascism is an anachronistic term for ancient Greece anyway. So this became a problem, like the critical template, the template of suspicion. This is, for a shorthand, people call it the hermeneutics of suspicion. And it is associated with the great thinkers Nietzsche and Freud and Marx. Like Nietzsche suggested that moral values are actually expressions of social forces, certain social classes who are shall we continue like this? Yeah. So social classes which are dominant, they present their idea of the good as the universal good. This kind of argument comes up. And in Marx, of course, the theory of ideology, is the key argument in Marx about suspicion, in the sense that you remember the key metaphor in Marx is that the human mind is like a pinhole camera. The ideological mind is like a pinhole camera. What is outside it has a reflection there, but it's upside down. So what is presented in an ideological consciousness is an inverted version of reality, like the working class, which is exploited, thinks that they are free citizens. This is an ideological delusion, yeah? Which Marx called false consciousness. Yes, so and Freud, of course, the idea of the unconscious itself is that is, we behave consciously, but our conscious behavior itself is affected, shaped, determined by something which we do not have access to. That is what we call unconscious. In fact, Freud spoke about the conscious and the unconscious as like two sides of a page. For one page to exist, the other page has to be there. It's not like another basket. So any conscious activity automatically presupposes an unconscious which we do not have access to, which at the same time puts pressure on our conscious behavior. Now, all these theoretical positions had a huge impact on developing critical ways of reading in literature and in humanities disciplines. But the point I'm making is that once this becomes an academic orthodoxy, once this becomes the standard template for approaching literary texts, then the only question which we think about is how can we dismantle the text in front of us? How can we find the hidden agenda, interests, etc. behind it? Yeah? And that, in my view, limits what we can gain from literary reading and from a truly critical humanities position now. So what would that be? Here I would like to, some of you may have read this essay, but I would like to refer to a very beautiful and important essay by this American theorist called Michael Warner. He has also written on the idea of the public. He has a book called Publics and Counterpublics. But he has an essay called Uncritical Reading. He asks the question, what exactly is critical reading? And it's very difficult to get an answer. Nobody is able to define it. All of us seem to know what critical reading is, but it's easy to see what uncritical reading is. Like, for example, just believing in the text, taking it at face value, thinking that characters are real people who exist, weeping when something happens to a character, something tragic happens to a character. All these are seen in the literary classroom as immature, delusional approaches to literary text. It is fiction. You shouldn't be crying. These are characters. They're made of words. So Warner says that his students, that can be true about all of us. It's not just his students. They do all these things. Like I'm sure that all of you, and me too, when I read a novel, I am moved by the characters, I am moved by the emotions in that narrative. I identify with characters. I behave in all kinds of uncritical ways. That is why we pick up novels, why we go to watch films, etc., etc. But in the literature classroom, officially, when you are writing an assignment, when you are answering a question in an examination, you keep all that aside. So in that sense, there is a kind of bad faith in the literature classroom. Like, what we actually feel about literature, we keep it outside. And we adopt a kind of disciplined critical position. We are pure reason when it comes to speaking about literature, writing about literature in the classroom. So naturally, there is a problem with this idea. So this bad faith comes from discrediting a large number of reading practices which are the staple of this particular form of writing that we call literature. Like novels and poems and films would not have survived these long centuries and still remain popular if everybody in the world practiced critical reading. It is uncritical reading that makes them move you, makes them inspire you. Yeah? So there is a disconnect between the literary practice on the ground and the critical practice, which is seen as the proper reading practice in the academy. There have been some criticisms. Michael Warner is one of them who pointed this out. But there have been some very interesting criticisms of this critical orthodoxy, as you may call it, in the academy. One such characterization came from the famous gender theorist Eve Sedgwick, who passed away. So Sedgwick uses some of the theories of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein to make an argument about the kind of problem that we are dealing with. She suggests that this excessively critical reading habit, which has come to dominate, psychologically speaking, it is paranoid in its nature. That is, the basic attitude is that the text is out to trick you. You know that paranoia, the paranoid person thinks that everybody is after them. Yeah? And even if you try to convince them that they are not, why should they be doing it, etc., etc., still it is very difficult to convince, because that basic attitude is one of anxiety, anticipating every negative move that the other person is potentially going to make. So even if the other person is friendly with you, a paranoid person would actually think that this is a trick to conceal the real intentions of that person. So the paranoid person, actually, interpretation has a paranoid element in it. This Marcel Proust wrote this very important, long novel called Remembrance of Things Past, in French, In Search of Lost Time. In that, there is a character who falls in love with somebody, but the main form of that love is jealousy. So when this woman smiles at him, he is, of course, he's intoxicated with happiness. But at the same time, the question comes up in his mind, has she smiled like this at other people before? Or does she smile? Is it a special, unique smile for me alone? Yeah? And so the more you are in love, in the case of this character, the more paranoid the person becomes. Like every kind of moment when she is not with him, he thinks, what is she doing? Is she telling me the truth, etc., etc. So this kind of calculation, this hyper intelligent activity of anticipating every move of the other person, is the key characteristic of that is an anxiety about anything that is unpredictable, an anticipatory anxiety about anything surprising. You could say that this excessively critical approach to literature shares that feature. That is, you don't want any surprises. You want to anticipate every move that the text is making. And you want to be one step ahead of the text and show that this is a trick, this is a trick, this is a trick. Yeah? So it's absolutely terrified of the possibility of surprise. Now, we don't have all that much time, but Melanie Klein, the psychoanalyst, she developed these ideas about paranoia in relationship to the child's early years. We know that human species is peculiar in the sense that they have the longest period of weaning, after they are born, before they become independent. It's a long period, unlike other animals. So which is also what gives rise to all these psychological complications. And so when the mother is with the child is happy. When the mother is away, in the initial stages, the child does not have a concept of time. It thinks that the mother has ceased to exist. It's no longer there. And there is this terror of the absence of the mother. Then the mother comes back again. So there is this fear that the mother may actually go away again. And the child tries to master this potential absence even when the mother is around. That is the paranoid, schizoid position. That you are kind of oscillating between happiness and terror when the mother is with you, mother is away with you, etc. From you. The good mother, the bad mother, etc. But then later on the child learns as it grows up, that these two kinds of mothers are the same person, and the good and the bad are the same. The mother who is nurturing you, being with you all the time, and the mother who has to go away, who goes away, are the same person. So you get a kind of what now we may call a realistic perception of the world. Interestingly, Melanie Klein called it the depressive position. As different from the paranoid position, this is a depressive position, which is not one of exhilaration, but one of accepting reality in its ambivalence, complexity. But the depressive position is open to surprises, whereas the paranoid position is terrified by surprises. It wants to anticipate everything. Yeah? Is it clear what I'm saying? Yeah. So this is the way in which Eve Sedgwick thought about this excessively critical reading. Whether it be a Marxist reading or feminist reading or whatever, it can be any kind of reading which tries to fix the meaning as a secret which the text is hiding from you, extracting it, presenting it before you, and in that sense, demystifying the text, exposing the text, taking it inside out, and saying that this is the real meaning. This is what actually goes on. This is a secret that the text is holding and concealing from you. Yeah? Now, for this kind of reading to happen, we need to have certain kinds of conditions. So these conditions are actually what Warner tried to investigate. What are the material conditions which are necessary for critical reading to happen? And one of them is actually, can I take this book for a second? Yeah. One of them is this book form, where we have pages, like all the novels, all the books which we read. Now people read things on the internet, but otherwise we have this book form that is a number of sheets which are actually stitched together. This is called the codex form. It has a very long history in the Western world. So codex involves our ability to go back and forth. So people who read detective novels would know that when a good detective novel reaches moves towards its conclusion, on the way you are given several false clues. You might think that the wrong person is actually the murderer. Yeah? But once it is resolved, you can go back and look at a lot of real clues which actually could not be recognized as clues as you read. Okay, this is what happened. This is why this detail was given. So in other words, we are doing a kind of double reading of the text. The first reading, where things are unfolding before us, where we do not know a lot of things, and then by the time we end reading the novel, we get the whole pattern, the hidden pattern, which is scattered around. Something which happens on page 17 has an implication what happens in page 250. They are far apart, but this codex form allows you to go back and look at it. Yeah? And so critical readings, one of the conditions is the codex form, which allows you to make connections between disparate moments from the text unfolding. And one has a good example of this, that is the great philosopher Spinoza, when he wrote a commentary on the Bible, the Holy Bible, he actually looks at, it's very similar to modern ideas of scholarship. That is, he makes the key terms, concepts, themes of the different books. He kind of writes them up in different sheets. And then he makes connections between them. Like this theme comes up here, it again comes up in that book. And you need to reconcile all the references to this same kind of theme. Because the Bible altogether is actually a unified whole with one single meaning. So what happens in the different books, they should all be in consonance with each other. They appear in different places. Now we have concordances. We actually make concordances of the same word appearing again, etc., etc. So the idea is actually to, even though the text unfolds like this, the idea is actually to make it into a network of closely connected elements. Some of them may come up in book 1, some in book 10, but they are all connected very closely together. They exist simultaneously. So this is a great example of critical reading. This is often what we try to do in relationship to literary texts, philosophical texts, etc., etc. What is actually the hidden structure? It is on the basis of that that often we make arguments about the secrets and things of that kind. Now, by the way, the codex form is now giving way. It's changing because now many of you would read on the screen. Like the last time I taught Ulysses in class, I had told as usual that you should bring a copy of the text to the class because we read it almost like poetry. You're zooming in on a passage, you are looking at, what's going on there. So please photocopy or buy, whatever, I also made some photocopy available. They could copy from that. So the next class, some people came with big photocopy bundle. Some came with the book. Some came like that, without anything. So I said, okay, we go to episode 3. We are looking at line number 17. They fish out their mobile phones and they are there. Yeah? So on the mobile phone, the whole Ulysses is there. They are following there. Now, when we read on the mobile phone, when we read on the computer screen, we are not using the codex format. We are using actually a format which existed in some cultures even earlier. That's a scroll. Yeah? We are scrolling back and forth. And this has very interesting implications. And the hypertext, for example, it has very interesting implications for the idea of the form of reading. But codex form, the only kind of reading it generates is not just the Spinoza kind of reading where different elements are closely tied together. A network of intricate connections between words is actually generated. There are other ways of using the codex. Warner cites an example of a white American woman called Mary Rowlandson, a white, probably English woman. She was actually captured by an American Indian war party in the 17th century. And when she was in captivity, she had no idea if or when she would be released. She actually opened the Bible for consolation. Now, we also do that. There are people who open the Ramayana or things like that. So there what we do is we open a random page. Yeah? A random page, and in some traditions you leave a certain number of lines and letters, and then you begin reading. So in some cultures you begin reading here, some here. Mary Rowlandson opened, in St. Augustine there is a similar kind of thing. She opens the Bible at random and reads the first words her eyes chance upon. And that passage said, do not worry, do not weep, you will be saved, or I don't remember the exact words. And she thought that was a good omen. She felt reassured by that. Now, where does that come from, this reassurance? We may think that it is pure chance. Yeah? But her point is, like Spinoza, she also thought that in the Bible, right through the Bible, what we hear is God's voice. Yeah? God's voice is continuous. The randomness takes away any agential interference on your part. I cannot actually put a bookmark with good passage and keep opening it. That won't work. It has to be random. That is when providential direction will come. Yeah? This providential direction is available to you only if you withdraw your willfulness and agency completely from this reading process. Yeah? You could say that this is an uncritical reading. Yeah? That it does not pass muster as critical reading. It's the opposite of that. But it is also reliant on the codex format. But unlike a reading which seeks to control, place everything in their respective positions in a structure, here you are yielding to the chance encounter with God's voice in the text. You are randomly opening it. Yeah? Now, Mary Rowlandson and people who open the Ramayana for predictions are not the only people who do this. There are a lot of reading practices which are not critical in the sense in which we spoke about it so far. I'll give you a couple of minor examples and we'll move on. There is a very important book by an anthropologist called Sabah Mahmood. In fact, many people were reading it about 10, 15 years ago. She studied Egyptian women's movement, Islamic women's movement called the Egyptian mosque movement. This is when Egypt was a secular country, Hosni Mubarak's time. And these women, they used to gather together, read the Quran. They were avid believers in the religion. They wanted to cultivate the quality of devotion, modesty. They wore the hijab. So many things which you may actually, which the Western world would actually see as disabling of Muslim agency, women's agency, they were practicing all that. But they were reading the Quran, discussing it, creating their own ideas about it, which put them in conflict with the mullahs in the religion, the male authority within the religion, because this women's reading of the Quran was completely different from the male authoritative reading. It also placed them in contradiction with the state at that time, because the state, secular state, did not want religion so much in open spaces. So the wearing the hijab and doing this was actually seen as a problem. But their idea was actually not to critically understand the Quran. Their idea was actually not to do to the Quran what Spinoza did with the Bible. Instead, their idea was actually to read it in a devotional context and develop certain practices of spiritual upliftment, spiritual determination, loyalty, etc., etc. Here, the reading of the text is less oriented to fixing the meaning of the text, but more a little bit like Rowlandson about how it can actually change you as a person or fashion you as a person. Now, in Kerala too, like for example, when Srinarayana Guru was writing his devotional poetry, and also the anti-caste verses sometimes which he wrote, in many of the assembly of Irava assemblies, these would be recited. Sometimes it would be a wedding. I have heard stories about Kumaranachan's poetry being recited at weddings. And the idea here is not really about so much to think about the meanings of words, debate the metaphysics of it, etc. But using these, hearing these, letting yourself be affected by the power of these verses which come from a thinker or a poet. Yeah. And in that sense to create what you may call new circumstances of sociability or sociality. Yeah. Recently there have been some very important work in Malayalam about the history of slavery and erstwhile slave castes in Kerala. Like Professor Sanal Mohan's work is of course central to that, modernity of slavery. Very recently, like a couple of months ago I think, Sanal Mohan and his brother Peter Matthew published a set of testimonies from the Dalit migration to Malabar the settlement which is created called Karikotakari. There is also a novel called Karikotakari in Malayalam by Vinoy Thomas. Much of it is about the oppression they suffered in the hands of what you may call the caste Christians, people who come from claimed upper caste lineages, particularly the Syrian Christian community. And then it is an Italian priest called Father Taffarel, who was working in Talasheri, who helped them create this settlement in Karikotakari and protected them, created a church, etc., etc. And it's a very moving set of testimonies. But what's interesting is that in one of the testimonies, when Father Taffarel asks this person, what is it that you want here? Like you're suffering, don't worry, like we'll find a solution. This person says, I just want to recite the prayer, the Lord's Prayer, in peace. Now, this idea that you want to recite this prayer in peace, and some testimonies say that it is after Taffarel Achan began intervening, it is after that that the Pulayas could actually breathe freely. Shwasam nere veenadu. But these are certain kinds of practices related to engagement with texts like prayers, reading, etc., which are not about critically dismantling them, analyzing them, but rather about using them to shape your life, being affected by it. You might think that this is a matter of religion alone. But if you read Achutha's autobiography, you will see that when they were in, after the Talasheri Pulpalli attack, when they were in the forest, when they were hungry and tired, they would read Mao Zedong's writings and feel inspired. Now, you may not agree with it or not, that's a different matter. But the way the texts were used, the way reading was done, is not always with this kind of analytical, paranoid, skeptical, knowledge-generating attitude. Now, I earlier mentioned that literary reading on the ground is not regulated by that. It is regulated by or inspired by or propelled by our ability to be moved, our ability to be affected by texts. Yeah. Now, sometimes, in our critical reading practice, we put a lot of stress on the plot, like the story as it unfolds, the way in which different events happen, etc., etc. But sometimes this plot structure of a book may be in complete contradiction with its emotional or affective structure. Like this problem was there right from the beginning when the novel came up as a form in the 18th century in England. There was a lot of anxiety about women reading novels. In India too, when novel came, the main anxiety was about women reading the novels. Why is it that? Because women may actually forget who they are and enter this imaginary world and believe in the story and become part of the story. They will forget their duties, etc., etc. There was another problem. Like Dr. Johnson, the famous lexicographer and critic and novelist too, Dr. Johnson tells the woman novelist Hannah More that you should not read certain kinds of books, like Tom Jones, etc., etc. But Samuel Richardson's novel, like Pamela. Now, Samuel Richardson is actually a Puritan. He is very strongly moralistic text. But even if you have a moralistic plot, a lot of things which happen in the novel may actually be salacious. Like you may have the rapist getting punished at the end of the novel, but the reader may actually be interested in reading the section about the rape. Or you may have adultery. That's another major theme. The adulterous couple may actually be punished by the plot at the end. But what if the reader takes on board the tragic end, but they are interested in reading this? So sometimes the plot structure will not tell you what the text's real where the text's real energies are. Sometimes the plot structure is merely a prop which allows some other kind of emotional or affective work to happen. Now, in my own work, I have found that when I was doing some work on Dalit autobiographies written in India, now we know that each Dalit autobiography is an achievement because people have come to the point of not only gaining education, but also writing their story, being able to publish it, intervene in the public sphere. That itself is an achievement. Many Dalit autobiographies actually trace a story of that. Yeah? It's a struggle which does not end, but there is achievement. But at the same time, the power of Dalit autobiography seems to come not from this narrative of achievement, but from the intense moments of suffering and humiliation, which often come up in the early parts of the autobiography. So you may have a plot structure which allows you to narrate this suffering. So what I'm trying to say is that interpreting literary texts according to their narrative structure may actually make you miss the point of the text, how the text works. Sometimes the plot itself may be like a structural alibi for certain kinds of emotions and effects to be generated. Like in the Dalit autobiographies, sometimes the narrative achievement and struggle gives a structure to present the unspeakable experiences of humiliation in their intensity. So, if we keep this in mind, and now I'll slowly move towards winding up, I would like to speak about two brief points and then I'll stop. One of them is about some of the new ways of reading. I would call them new ways of criticism, which have come from this space that I'm indicating of recognizing the affective power of text and trying to see the critical possibilities of that. Some of this, one great example of this, some great examples of this have come from African American criticism, African American thinking. One notable example of that is the work of the poet and critic Fred Moten. Now, Fred Moten has a very interesting essay called The Resistance of the Object. In that, he is actually commenting on certain moments in black articulation of slave experience in texts, in music, etc. Now, one key autobiographical text in the Black American tradition is the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Now, many of you may have seen that. Now, in that, there is an opening incident where Frederick Douglass, he was born as in a condition of slavery in a house. In the same house, his aunt was also a slave. Her name was Hester. And the slave owner, that's the house owner, master of the house, he used to whip her regularly in the kitchen. And there is a description of that, this child encountering this ghastly experience of torture of the slave. This Aunt Hester was asked to stand on a stool, then her arms are tied to a kind of loop which is there on the ceiling. And then this man begins whipping her from behind, and she begins screaming, blood begins pouring. It's a very dramatic moment. It's frequently kind of cited in Black American history, and she screams and screams. Fred Moten reads this passage alongside a passage from Marx's Capital, where it's actually not really, he uses that to make a point. Marx, in Das Kapital, Volume 1, Marx often writes in this kind of ironic, humorous tone as well. He's discussing the commodity. And he says that if commodities could speak, they would tell this story. Now, if commodities could speak, the idea is that commodities cannot speak. They are inanimate objects. Marx's point is that what gives them value is the human exchange of relationships. That's what. So, but Fred Moten says, in Aunt Hester, you have a commodity which speaks. Because you know that chattel slavery meant buying and slaves as commodity. So, what would be the speech of a commodity? And Moten's argument is that the speech of this commodity is not at the level of articulate language, which can be interpreted, but at the level of what he calls the phonic materiality of the scream. You cannot analyze a scream according to a semiotic ideology. There is no lexicon of screams, but the scream is something which communicates. And there are also stories in the context of slavery, like Edward Glisson, for example, has argued that since slaves were forbidden to speak, often they would communicate by using various kinds of howls, which they would be able to decipher. So there is a range of articulation which is just outside the edge of articulate language. In order to understand that, you need to listen to the affective intensity rather than to the semiological referential structure of what is being spoken about. So this problem is not only a case of verbal communication and language. There are similar arguments which are made about visual images. Like certain visual images, like in medieval icons, it's very clear. They are actually seen as, you are not merely looking at them as an artifact. Like if it is an image of a divine being, you are taking a kind of darshan. You are affected by the presence of the object. And there are many instances of that, and there are also kind of contemporary scholars of photography who have spoken about not what the photograph directly presents, but what it often leaves outside its main frame, like the tension of the body, the tension of the muscles, etc., which are very. In fact, there is a very interesting study of a studio in Uganda. This is the students here may not know about Idi Amin, but he was an important presence when we were growing up. And Idi Amin was seen as a despotic ruler, and there are lots of stories about killing. And so at Idi Amin's time, the British government, who were the former colonizers of Uganda, they offered citizenship to Ugandans who wanted to migrate to the UK. So of course, to go to UK, you need a visa, you need a passport, etc. So like in India, there are photo studios who actually offer you a deal. Like if you take 4 photographs, passport photographs, you get it for 30 rupees, etc., etc. So this particular studio in Uganda, they would give you either 4 photographs for a higher price or 2 full-length photographs for a lower price. You need only 2 passport-size photographs. So many people actually took the second option of full-length photographs, from which the studio would cut out their face and give it to them for use for the passport application. And the rest of the photograph they would chuck into a bin. This bin was the archive used by the scholar. So in that, you often see the rest of the body. And sometimes a woman's picture, a child is sleeping on her lap. It won't come into the passport picture, but it is there. Sometimes the clenching of muscles, the tensions. Now these do not have a clear symbolic or iconic significance, but they have a kind of some kind of corporeal intensity and circumstances is communicated. This scholar, whose name is Tina Campt, she called it listening to images, not seeing the images, not trying to kind of look at the image and capture the visual content, but to listen to the pressures which surround the creation of that image. Now, these kinds of instances, whether it be Aunt Hester's scream, or whether it be the kind of devotional text affecting you, or the political text inspiring you, or the examples which I gave of these prosthetic images, they demand a reading which is not the kind of critical reading which we began with. They ask us to pay attention to or concentrate on something which would open up the text rather than fix its meaning. In some sense, you could say that this is what I would like to conclude with. Like here, critical humanities, the position is not to give you or not to reach out and attain a superior critical position, which exposes the secret of cultural phenomena and fixes it for good. Rather, it is a question of beginning with the assumption that we do not know this phenomenon. And we need to kind of learn to know it. We need to familiarize ourselves with the phenomenon. We need to make its acquaintance. If it's a novel or a poem, rather than trying to figure out what the novel is hiding from you, first thing is actually we need to, like with human beings, you need to make its acquaintance, figure out how it is behaving, how it is affecting you. And see, we often use the word unfold, the text unfolds over a period of time. Now, I don't remember, there was a thinker who spoke about the word unfolding in two different senses. One sense of unfolding is, imagine that I have made a boat or an aeroplane or a flower with this piece of paper. I can unfold it into a flat plane of paper. That is one sense of unfolding. The second sense of unfolding is when a blossom unfolds petal by petal into a flower. Now, these are two different ideas of unfolding. Now, the second gesture, that is the affective reading which I was trying to speak about, is a bit like the second idea. That is, unfolding it, what you initially see is a blossom. Only by getting acquainted with it, waiting with patience, watching it, can you see how it actually develops. Now, this idea, Gayatri Spivak, I heard her say this in a discussion of reading philosophical texts. She says that close reading is not what I have in mind, because close reading, which we often use as a term, in some sense is motivated by control, because you want to chart everything on the text. You want to see how things are related, what their effects are. You need to have complete command over it. You need to have control over it. Whereas here you do not have control. What you're doing is more like a bird watcher or an animal watcher or whatever. You're waiting for the text to work on you, yield to the power of the text, and let it open up. But this letting it open up also has what it may actually show you may not always be pleasant. It may actually demand new stances in relationship to sociability or politics from you. If literary texts or cultural texts have that kind of possibility, then that is their politics. To excavate that template of the critical method may not be helpful, because it may flatten the text into a predictable political message. It is more in the contradictions and the difficulties in that unfolding that the actual political, affective force of the text relies. Now, to conclude, in that sense, I would say that literary reading in this second sense, where it actually does not try to flatten, but more like this affective attention, I feel that it can actually be a very important point of entry into language uses which are closely tied with force. Now, in my own work, I have been making some very preliminary attempts to study. I got into it because of an interest in the form called the slogan, like Mudravakyam in Malayalam. Now, slogan is a particular kind of linguistic practice where language is involved, sound is involved. It's a sonic practice. And at the same time, it's also a corporeal practice because of assembly is needed. And even when you are shouting a slogan alone, like some major political figures have done on the way to the gallows, etc., it implicitly is conjuring up a collective, which may be absent there. So in forms like this, and I was trying to look into what are the kind of elementary forms which get into things like the slogan, or these kinds of utterance forms which have a strong component of force. And I did a tiny bit of work on the form of the prayer, which often underlies petitions, etc., and the form of the curse, which underlies many of the political, critical, angry slogans which actually come up. Now, in order to look into these configurations of language, the kind of literary reading that I have been speaking about can be a very useful point of entry. Because here the point is not to extract an ideological message or something which is hidden, but how the performance of language affects you, shapes you, puts pressure on you, makes you able to intervene in a space, a public space where other bodies, other ways of listening are in operation. And the beginning of this, I would say, so to come back to the question, what do we actually study in the literature classroom, what do we train ourselves in? I would say that it's a certain kind of attention. An attention, in fact, slowing down is important there. You know? The attention where you actually let the object loosen up. Don't try to fix it, let it loosen up and begin to reveal things. Now, when I say slow, I'm not suggesting that it should take a long time, because you know that, you know, like the students here would know it much better than people like me, like the memes, for example. Now, memes demand a reading which is very different from the language reading, because it's often like a puzzling. You know, there is an element of doing a puzzle which involves a visual component and a verbal component, but there is no dictionary or grammar which would allow you to predict the way they intersect. For that to click, you cannot immediately try to say that anticipate. You cannot have that anticipation which would erase surprise, because memes work by surprise. There is no other way in which they work. So it is this second kind of reading that I thought it would be useful for us to think about when we talk about literary reading in the literature classrooms now. Thank you very much.